Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about IFC projects, attributes, and properties.
Just a recap of what we discussed before. openBIM is BIM without that's not locked into a vendor. IFC is the biggest ISO standard out there, which describes concepts. The word class in Industry Foundation Classes stands for the meaning is basically a concept, a way of describing something. And every time you see here, it starts. I click on an object from a piece of IFC data. You can see it starts with the word IFC wall or IFC slab or IFC window. All of those are examples of classes. And today we'll be talking about one particular class called the IFC project class. And the first thing to realize is that even though it sounds really important, like it's the project, there's actually no difference between the IFC project class and any other class in IFC. It's just another class. And it has, and just like every single other classes, it has attributes that can be assigned to it, and it has a class. And we talked last time about rooted and non-rooted class. This is something that users care about, so it's a rooted class, so it has a name and a global ID. So I've just imported this file, and you can see here, this is the IFC project object, and you can see it has a global ID, it has a name, a long name, and a phase attribute associated with it. And it's not at all different to any other class. All classes have attributes, and all rooted classes have global IDs and names, so there's nothing too special about it. But the reason why we want to talk about it is because the project class is the first class that that people go to when they want to learn more about a piece of BIM data. So when you give a BIM model to somebody else, you can give it to them in form of a file or something else entirely, but there's a whole bunch of data in there. You know, there's walls and there's buildings and there's sites and all that. But the first piece of information which they look for, or any software looks for when it tries to understand your BIM data, is an IFC project class. And then from that IFC project file class, it will then look for things that are related to that project. So for example, construction types are related to the project, or sites and buildings are indirectly related to the project. And this gives a type of tree of hierarchy of BIM data, which you can see on the top right here. And the very top one in this tree is always going to be the IFC project. And it's worthwhile mentioning simply because sometimes BIM programs hide that from you. They don't actually show you that at the very top there is a project. And right now, maybe that's not too important, but it does become a bit more important when in the future we start using IFC more, because you don't necessarily have to have a project at the very top. There are a few other alternate ways you can start your BIM data. For example, the way we're doing right now is starting it with an IFC project, which describes an actual thing which is going to be built. But you can also have something called a project library. And these are ways of containing data that, or BIM assets, or material libraries, or things which are not belonging to one particular project, but can be shared across many projects. And this is a great way for people to be distributing government standards or company standards in an openBIM format. Now, unfortunately, not a lot of people are using project libraries. So for today, we won't talk too much about that. We'll talk just about an IFC project. Is that kind of making sense so far?
Yeah, to some degree, yes.
Right. We're going to take a quick skip over to the documentation. For the technical people here who want to find this in the documentation, you can go to technical.buildingsmart.org and go to Standards, IFC Specifications Database, which you'll go to. And then if you browse to the latest specification, you'll get to this page. A good way to find these things is by clicking on the inheritance listings, and then on the left, clicking on all entities. This will give you a list of every single class available in IFC, and there's a huge long list here. So if you just search on the page for IFC project, here it is. And by the way, here's the project library that I just spoke about. You can click on that and you can read more. But we won't go too far on it simply because that gets a little bit too technical. But that's where you want to find it if you do want to dig in a bit deeper. So now, what we'd also like to do is talk about attributes. Every single class in IFC can store data associated with it. And the simplest way to store data with a class is in its attributes. And over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice that whenever I click an object in my BIM model, I have a list of attributes on the right, and I can click from this drop-down list of different attributes, and I can press add attribute, and I can give it a value. Like this is a description of my wall, because I've now selected a wall. And practically that's all an attribute is. It's a fixed, very small set of data that's determined by the international standard that can be assigned to an object. Now, most of the attributes that you'll be dealing with in your program are simple ones like where you can just assign a value, like the name of this wall is this, for example. And last week we talked about how each of these attributes have very specific rules on how you're meant to fill them out. So for example, this name, which is basic wall : 250 mm and so on, is not a very meaningful name. Yeah. And in fact, the ISO standard says it needs to be effectively named what you'd label it in documentation. Now, not many people actually label walls in their documentation. They label the wall construction type, but not each individual wall, unless it's something like prefabricated or a precast concrete. So let's say this was a precast concrete wall, for example, and we might call that Pecon 01, for example. And then this next piece of precast concrete might be Pecon 02, so you can keep track of each piece. So that's just one example. But there are also other attributes which can be stored in IFC classes, which are not so simple. They are not a thing like where you can see the key is name and the value is Pecon 01. You can also store attributes that are different types of objects associated with it. So this is something that's getting a little bit more technical as well. So if I look over here at the IFC project class, and I look down at this list of attributes that can be stored on an IFC project, I can see that one of the things that can be stored, if I scroll down here, is units in context. That means that the IFC project actually stores the project units. So for example, things like whether your project is in millimeters or in meters or in inches, what your area units are, what your volume units are, and so on. Now, you'll notice that whereas these types of attributes are what it calls an IFC label, this one is something a little bit different. And the reason I bring this up is because it's still an attribute, but it stored something. It stores something a bit more special than a piece of text. And so you'll often have to find places in your BIM program to store this piece of information, and it sometimes is not too obvious. So for example, in Blender, if I wanted to change the units for my project, I would actually go to this panel here, and I would set the units that are used in my project. So I might say, okay, I'm doing metric. My length will be stored in centimeters. My area will be stored in square meters, and volume will be stored in square meters, for example. So just be aware that there are some attributes in IFC that are not so simple to store because they're a bit more complicated than just a piece of text. And so you might need to search. If somebody says, hey, can you please set the unit attribute on your project correctly, what they actually mean is you'll have to search for somewhere in your project, in your BIM program settings. But effectively, what you're doing is storing an attribute. Is that kind of still making sense, or am I just rambling on here?
Yes, yes, but don't worry. I can watch 10 times after that the video. So at some point I will understand. So yeah.
Please interrupt me if I'm saying this in a really confusing way. And by the way, those of you who want to write a question or a comment and don't want to sign up to Twitch, you can do so by going to osarch.org. And on the top right, there is a link which goes to a live chat page, and we'll monitor that live chat as well.
Yeah, and please do leave the questions here, and I'll ask them at the end. We go through them at the end.
Okay. So, but that's pretty much it for attributes. All you have to know is that there's not too many attributes which can be set. Your BIM program should guide you on what attributes you can set per every single object. If you don't, you may have to do a bit of searching. So, for example, I do want to mention this because in Blender, it's very easy. You can just check this drop down. You can say, okay, what attributes are available to me, and I can just press add and fill them in. But on some BIM programs, and it's not so easy. And this is not because IFC makes it difficult. It's because the BIM program is making it difficult. And I do want to highlight this because this is a big reason why we're getting such low quality data, because our BIM programs are making it difficult for us to create this basic data, like creating the name. Like this small tiny file has a really poor name for every single one of these objects. And the reason is not necessarily because we want to do a bad job as architects and engineers, but because the software is making it really difficult for us to get this data correct. So just to explain my point, if you are using Revit, for example, and I hate to sound like somebody who's always talking about Autodesk here, but in Revit, you will not find a dropdown. You will also not find the list of attributes you can add to your object. You will have to search for it yourself in the documentation. So you will actually need to click on all those complicated links that I clicked here and find a particular object that you're interested in, like let's say a wall. Let's say you want to know what attributes you can give to a wall. And then you can go down to attributes. You have to click this because it's hidden by default. I know it's really all confusing and terrible. And then you have to say, okay, name. I can set a name. You have to skip the first this one because it's not a label. It's more complicated. And remember how I mentioned how these more complicated attributes, you can't easily set them in the UI. You have to go to a specific location. And then I don't have Revit on this machine because this is Linux. But if I did, what I'd show you is that you'd have to use, there is a distributed shared parameters file, which you can add a parameter to the object. If not, you'd have to type it in manually and make sure you type it in exactly with no typos. And only then you can fill out that value. So it's quite a laborious process and quite error prone. It's made a little bit better with the shared parameters file, which again, I will point out to people because I'm aware that a lot of people on this call are probably using proprietary software. So if I click on here, there is a shared parameter file, which if I go to it, it sets up all the parameters you'll need to add all of the various attributes that you're allowed to add. So for example, to add a name attribute in Revit, you're not allowed to call it name. You have to call it IFC name, spelled exactly like that. And if I wanted to then add let's say here I want to add this description attribute, I'd have to add a new parameter called IFC description, and so on. And then if you want to add it for a type object, it's different. Again, you have to, there's another shared parameters file where you have to add IFC name and in square brackets type. So you can see it's all pretty convoluted, and this kind of explains why it's pretty complicated. I see somebody has just thrown into the chat that
Yes.
that they are mentioning the geometry driven IFC add-in.
No,
I
no.
absolutely recommend
Yeah,
people.
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I do recommend people do check it out. It is a very good add-in. I simply talk about this one because it's kind of easily available to everybody. You don't need to pay money for it. And it is open source. And so there should be absolutely no excuse to get this one. Although, yes, there are other add-ins to make it easier to get these attribute data correct. Sorry, I interrupted there, Petra.
No, no, no. I was thinking to answer to the questions at the end, so to not to have it more fluid presentation. So
Oh, okay.
now I
Sorry.
don't have any
Oh,
question to ask you at the end. So guys,
okay.
please write some questions there.
All right, and I'll ignore all future questions. But yeah, it can be quite a convoluted process, and sometimes it's not obvious. If you are by luck using a program, and it doesn't have to be Revit, there are other programs which have the same issue, that doesn't provide an easy interface. Like you have to create your own mappings and all that, and you do want to find out a nice, easy way without clicking through, through all of these links in the specification. There's a shortcut to it, which I can recommend here, is to go to the Blender BIM website. And if you go to the training and support page, click on which IFC class should I use? And this should cover most of the stuff that you have to worry about. It doesn't cover more complex things like projects and yeah, it doesn't cover projects, but for most objects you can just type it in here. So for example, if I want to know what attributes I can add to a slab, once I found it here, I click on the read more, and that will immediately bring me to the right page in the official specification. And then you have to scroll down, and if you see here attribute definitions and there's only one thing there, that's a short answer is scroll past that and click on this thing which says attribute inheritance. It doesn't look as though you can click on it, but if you do click on it, surprise, you get this big table with all the attributes. I know, they like to make it difficult, don't they? And then you can see here's a list of attributes, but then it gets also a bit tricky. You should only pay attention to the ones which have a number in this column. I know, why is it so difficult? It shouldn't be this difficult. They should just, anyway.
Yeah.
But the reason I mention all this is because the vendor support right now is so poor that users actually need to do this. They, like, for example, remember how I said that attributes have rules on what you're allowed to fill out? So this one is not a, we won't call it a rule that is black and white. This is a more gray rule. There's a recommendation, but there is not a black and white rule that the program will get upset with you if you fill in the wrong value. But there are things which will get upset with you. So for example, if I wanted to set a predefined type. So for example, you'll find that here I'm looking at a slab, so maybe I'll pick a slab here. So this is a slab, and this is a slab in the documentation. Mm-hmm. And if I scroll down, one of the attributes says predefined type. And this is a very special type of attribute because there is a preset list of values which you're allowed to pick. You're not allowed to pick any other values. And this is often a very useful attribute which many people don't fill out, or they leave it to the default and it gets filled out incorrectly. So the predefined type is like a third level of hierarchy of defining the classification of an object. So when we talk about a slab, the predefined type will tell us what type of slab it is. So for example, Blender BIM, it's very easy. It's just got a drop down. So we say, okay, it's a floor slab, a roof slab, a landing slab. And then if, and these are all standard values for that attribute. And you can just pick from there. And if it's not part of there, there's a special value called user defined. And then it prompts you to set your own definition. So I don't know what to, I don't know, hovering slab, if we're doing some fancy who knows what slab. So unfortunately, in many BIM programs, they don't tell this to you. So how are you as a user going to know the right value to put into these attributes if your BIM program doesn't tell you? Unfortunately, you have to do that game where you find the thing in the documentation, you click the read more link, you scroll down, find the invisible table, which you can only find by clicking this thing, which doesn't even look like a link. Scroll down to the one you're interested in, and then you actually have to click this, which will tell you the list of valid values you can put in there. And I just want to stress that it sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but it really doesn't have to be this way. What we're asking here that there are a list of standardized attribute values that users can pick from is not too much to ask. And very often we are already doing that in our BIM work. We already have company standards which say things like this attribute must either be filled with A, B, or C, nothing else. You guys do that when you fill out spreadsheets, right? When you do columns to get clean data, you create standards saying on this column, you can either have yes, no, or not, or NA, not applicable. You know, we do that all the time, and that's how you get clean data. Now, unfortunately, people are not aware that that there are these standards of how to fill out these attributes. And the vendors, unfortunately, don't do a particularly good job of it either. And as users, we need to realize what's possible and request these to vendors. And if it's not easy enough, work out whether we're using third-party add-ons or we report bug reports back upstream. We have to say, hey, we can do better with our BIM data. Sorry, I kind of went on a rant there, but is this useful? Is this?
I hope so.
I hope people in the audience. I don't know what people are saying. Maybe they're, they've muted me in the background or something.
No, I don't think so. But do you still have something to tell us about this, or can we go to the last part of the presentation?
Yeah. So, what do we have today? Today was
projects,
attributes and properties.
Yes.
Okay. So, attributes are a small set of highly strictly defined values you can assign to each project. To each IFC element or IFC class. But a property is a little bit more flexible. A property are similar to attributes in that it has a name of the property, and sometimes you can fill in a simple text value, and sometimes you can fill in more complicated values, like something with a unit or something, or like a table of values. But it's a little bit different in that you can group it. And each IFC class has a set of groups which are applicable to it. And instead of group, the actual term they use is set. So, for example, if I scroll down here, you can see that here are all the property sets associated with this slab. And the first one is called pset_slab common. And it's got a whole bunch of names and a whole bunch of values. And then this one says constraints and names and values, dimensions, names and values, and so on. And there's a lot of them. And these are what properties are. They are a lot more flexible, and some of them are standardized by Building Smart, things that are very common, but you also have the freedom to create your own. So, to find the standardized ones are always named with pset underscore at the beginning of it as a prefix.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever you create your own, you're not allowed to start it with that. So for example, this one, this pset slab common, is a standardized one, and all of these ones, called constraints and dimensions and other, are not standardized ones. They are just random data that either you decided to put out, your program decided to put out, or your project decided to put out, that does not, for whatever reason, belong to something that is part of the international standard. So every single class can only have certain property sets applied to it. So if I click on this drop down here are the list of property sets that are allowed to be assigned to the slab. And for example, over here you can see pset slab common, or pset precast slab, or pset reinforcement bar pitch of slab are all allowed to be assigned to the slab. But if I click on this window, for example, and I click on this drop down, you can see that the list is different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't find pset slab, I don't find slab common, I don't find reinforcement bar pitch of something. I'm not a structural guy. The property sets that are available to you are different. And in an ideal world, again, your BIM program will present to you what you're allowed to set and what you're not allowed to set. But just like my warning before with attributes, there are some BIM programs that do not make this obvious to you. They make it, well, again, you have to check the specification.
Mm-hmm.
This one you can also find out on that same page. Again, if you click the read more link, and if you just scroll past that invisible table, you can see here this section which says property sets for objects. And again, this is only if you're using a BIM program that hasn't implemented openBIM particularly well, where you have to read these things and you read the name and the property names that you're allowed to set. And it tells you for each one of those what type of data you send there. So for example, whether it's a true or false, or whether it's a particular unit that you need to put into there. So now what's also important to realize is that this does depend on your IFC version as well. And sometimes the vendors, may create dirty data. And this makes things complicated when we expect clean data. So for example, if I check this slab and I'm on the page for a slab, I look at the slab common over here, I can see reference, pitch, angle, is external, and load bearing, and I should expect to find all of them here. And in this case, I do. I find reference, I find pitch angle, I find is external, and load bearing. So that's a good sign that this data is clean. You'll also notice that not all of the properties are set, and this is okay. You don't need to set all of the properties. However, if I press the edit button, you'll see that it detects all of the missing properties that are not yet set. So it says, oh, by the way, you could also fill out the fire rating on this. And the fire rating, in this case, is a label. And to find out more, you'd have to check your local jurisdiction, and ideally in the future, Building Smart will provide a tool of better determining the correct values to place it here. But here, technically, I could fill out any valid any sort of short text value. So in Australia, it might be something like this, but that would be different in your different part of the world. And when you press save, you can see that it's now got the new values being set. So now if you do want to create your own property sets, you can of course do that. And this is where it starts to get interesting. But I do want to advise that before you create your own, please do try to look up if there is a more standard ISO location for it, because as you can see here, there's a lot of stuff, right? If I want to fill out, I don't know, warranty information, if I scroll down to the bottom, here's a whole bunch of already standardized data I could set to do with warranties. So I do advise people to check that. Now, one more thing I do want to describe about properties that are different from attributes, other than the fact that there's a bunch of standardized sets and you can create your own, is that there's something called property inheritance in IFC. So most IFC objects can be associated with a standardized construction type. So these walls, for example, over here, you can see that it's part of a construction type, a wall construction type called basic wall 250. And if I press this, all of these walls have the exact same construction type. Mm-hmm. And for most properties, and I say most here because it's there is a bit of detail about this. If you don't, you can either assign a property to this object, or you can assign a property to this type object. So this type object is actually invisible because there is no standard representation of this wall, because a wall can be however long it needs to be. So if I just jump to this particular object, and now what I'm viewing here on the right is no longer the attributes and all that of my wall. Now I'm viewing the attributes of my wall construction type. So I'm just going to repeat that in case people missed it. So if I click here, this panel shows all of the data about this wall. But now I'm going to switch over and view the properties and attributes of this wall construction type. It's another object in the IFC file. And sometimes it will be an invisible object because there's no geometry associated with a typical wall type, for example. There could be, but in this case, there isn't. And you can see that I could also assign attributes and properties to the wall type. So here are all of the attributes, the properties that are assigned to the wall type, not the wall type. And for most of these, if I specify it to the construction type, but I don't specify it to the wall by default inherits the value. And in Blender BIM, you can see that pretty easily. If you scroll down, so here are all the properties which are assigned directly to this wall. But if you keep on scrolling down, it will say here is data that is not directly assigned to this wall type, but it is assigned to the construction type. And because it's assigned to the type, it flows on, and that data is inherited by that wall. And you can see why this is useful, right? If you have, you don't want to define the fire rating of every single individual wall. If you have a typical wall construction type, you assign that property to one thing, which is the type object, and then that will automatically get inherited by everything else.
Sure.
So that's something which attributes don't have. There's a slight edge case which some people in the audience might be picking up now about user-defined and predefined type attributes, but for most things, you can assign properties to the type, and it's actually recommended to do so, especially if it's valid. Well, of course it's recommended to do so if it's valid. You should do it, and and that will save you from creating a whole bunch of unnecessarily duplicated data. So, I see here construction function exterior. Then I see over here, it says, where is it? Is external? In fact, there it is. Is external true? If that sort of is meaning the same thing, which in this case I'm not sure because this is a non-standard property set, whereas this one is, but assuming the intention was for function exterior and is external true to be the same thing, then it should have just been defined once, not twice. So this one should be deleted. You shouldn't actually see that there. Okay, maybe we should do some questions and answers.
Yes.
We didn't get into the details of how to create your own property set.
But why would you want to do that? Only if you don't find it already predefined, right? By another standard.
Correct.
But
absolutely.
Already to get to this point, Dion, how many projects do you think there are out there that they are using this requirement to such detail?
How many people are defining property sets and for company standards and local government standards? Well, none that I have worked on personally. Obviously I do so, but coming from external to the projects that I get involved with, I don't see it coming to me.
Yeah.
I have to sort of take the initiative on it, unfortunately, which is a shame.
Nahohak, can you please explain? You say many actually. There are many projects out there where there are requirements according to IFC to building smart. Which country? And can you give some examples?
So because Nahuak is typing, maybe while he's responding, we can answer some other questions.
Yeah, I can ask you something actually. If very briefly, what's the difference between attributes and the properties? Very briefly, what's the main difference between them?
The main difference is an attribute is highly defined and can only be assigned to a single class. So, and a property, the difference is that there are many properties. They can be grouped into property sets. They can be assigned to multiple objects simultaneously. I should have mentioned that. And they can inherit from the construction type. So those are the primary differences.
Okay, thank you. Please, how can we set or build in local building codes? Paulson Miller.
Well, if you are working on these, if you are using these international standard P sets, right now there is an initiative called the Building Smart Data Dictionary, which has the objective of providing a central dictionary where people can look up standardized values, which may be for products, which may be for industries, so that you can assign them in an easy way to objects within your BIM program. However, current implementations of this are still quite experimental. So unfortunately, it's not quite there yet, but the simple act of starting to use these attributes and storing it in these, using these properties and attributes and storing it in these properties is a step in the right direction. And none of this is things you're not already doing. Everybody is already storing an attribute called fire rating in your walls, or I please hope you are doing that in your BIM projects, because that's pretty useful data in your BIM model. So I hope you're already storing that. And I hope the format in which you're storing it is also following a local building code standard. So it's not different to what you're already doing. The only difference is that you're assigning it here rather than assigning it to some random property which Bob created in the office as a standard 3 years ago.
Yeah. Can I ask you something regarding this? You said that the fire rating should be in the 3D model, right? But what's happened when you are required to deliver drawings then? What's the point to put it there then when it's easier to just describe this in another document?
The drawings in the BIM model is the same thing. The drawing is just a representation of the BIM model.
Yes.
The whole purpose of a drawing is to direct the user, is to focus the user's attention to a particular piece of data or information.
Yeah. Problem with that is, I mean, from a budget perspective, right? You have a client that is requiring for you to deliver drawings. So why should you put time in putting this in the, if you don't have this in BIM execution plan or somewhere else in a exchange information requirement? So why should you just you don't have, like, you do double work in a way. Of course I completely agree. If you have a client that is requiring you to deliver these specifications in your 3D model or in the 3D model you are delivering, then yes, be my guest. And this is happening in Norway, for example, on the projects where they don't require drawings anymore. And that makes sense, right? But when you require drawings, I'm trying to say that it's difficult to implement this if the requirements are not right.
I would agree, and it's really and doing these things digitally sometimes results in less work. Like when you are doing a large project and you have economies of scale of being able to filter and bulk set and generate reports and all that, yeah, you get time savings from that. But doing all this openBIM stuff is additional work. Let's be frank with it. It's additional work, but the reason it's additional work is because it's creating additional value. The whole point of this is getting out of it a digital data set of which you can then analyze your building, and you can then coordinate your building with other people. Now, if people don't have the workflows for coordinating with this stuff digitally, then you're not going to get value out of it, and you're not asking for it, and then you get your whole chicken and egg problem. If the client just wants paper drawings, maybe because they're not interested in digitally owning their asset, then that's because that's what the value they see in it. Whereas if a client says, actually, there is value in a digital asset, and the value could be due to them having a large real estate portfolio, right? There's a difference between having one building and having 50 buildings and having 100 buildings.
Of course.
If you own 100 buildings, this digital data becomes a lot more valuable because you can start querying it for asset management or maintenance, for example, or refurbishments or building lifecycle, and so on. It's also different whether or not it's just for you or it's for many people. For example, if it's your house, maybe you just want the plans and you live in it and you don't think too much. But if from the perspective of a government which has public services running through that land, which you know that are going to have to be replaced and maintained or keep track of in case somebody digs something up, that makes sense to be in a digital database. And if you're managing different contracts that have to pass through many hands, maybe one guy doesn't care whether it's paper or not, but the next guy, like imagine if you were trying to refurb a building and one guy gives you paper drawings and the other guy gives you a DXF file. Who do you like as the next guy in line? The guy who receives paper or DXF? Well, usually the guy who reads it. So,
you took this
it's extra work.
You took this too far. I'm just saying, like, it makes much more sense, and it's naturally for people that ditch drawings for, like, they don't require drawings anymore. And then from this perspective, it's naturally, of course, you should have it, right? So encouraging this or adopting this kind of requirements on your project, then it makes sense to have as much as needed information for maintenance and operating.
Quick question to Cyril, because he did answer, and he's absolutely right that people do specify properties all the time. I'm just a little bit curious because I haven't come across people specifying it as a property set definition, and that's what I was looking for, because I obviously in many large projects people do specify, please provide all these properties, but I do want to mention, and we won't get into it today, but in IFC there is actually a special way to define properties called a property set definition file, and over here it looks something like this, and you can specify the exact unit type, which is part of the IFC standard, and you can also set, remember how I talked how properties can inherit? you can actually set how it inherits or what type of objects it can apply to. And I haven't come across people assigning that. I'd be very excited to know if somebody is in the world. And also which BIM programs do support loading in these property sets, because that's definitely the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that was good. Cyril for Nahohak. Also, I work with general contractors which have hundreds of custom properties required in each field. Are you using Blender at your work, or are you using Revit or other software?
I think the question is agnostic of the program.
Yeah.
But my interpretation is that yes, people.
It's not a question. It's just a statement. I was curious what he's using for this. If he's using a Blender BIM in production.
I think he does use a bit of it, Cyril. A little bit, obviously not the main tool,
but you can go ahead with the lead you have.
Yeah, I will check some of the questions from the chat, the live chat.
There is one more from here. Is it possible to give ownership to properties instead of objects? For example, a fire engineer who would assign fire ratings in a wall an architect designed.
Good question. I don't think there is a way in the specification, as in like, I don't think there's a technical way to do it, but there are non-technical guides on certain properties. So for example, a good example is Kobe. So Kobe is a specification of data which needs to be stored in IFC. So even though there's no actual data value, like I won't, like in an element I can see owner history, for example, and there's like liability and all that. Whereas a property, there you won't find that attribute. I don't think. I'll have a quick check because now I'm curious. So I will check that. I don't think you can, but for example, in Kobe, they do have a matrix which says that here is the default position that says that, by the way, in this phase of the design, in this use case, and there's like a whole bunch of verbose written documentation which says, by the way, you should fill out these sets of properties. And then in this phase in the design, while this use case is happening, you should fill out this. So it's kind of fluffy, not very black and white. But I will check just in case I'm missing or I forgot about. Oh, sorry, I take that back. I take all of that back. I'm totally wrong. Property sets and even the definition has an owner history. Yeah, so technically you can do it, but I haven't implemented it. I don't know anyone who has. If anyone in the chat knows anyone who's built this, please let me know, because that's amazing and we should totally take them up and maybe I should build it too.
Yeah.
Right? Because 2 is better than 1.
Please go ahead with the next questions from your chat.
We'll take a break from the Twitch chat, and I'll just read it out from just because I've probably been ignoring these people, so we'll read the stuff.
Oh,
look, Cyril just found out he can click on attribute inheritance. That's right, guys. You don't. It's ridiculous. The documentation doesn't even. Okay, if it's anybody from here building smart, please. It's like one line of CSS to fix that in your in your documentation. So just reading through this quickly. How do tags work? Can you have multiple tags? Okay, tags is a very, very is a attribute you'll find on almost every single object in IFC. So you can see here tag. It's not what you think it is. So, and I think this is kind of like a fault of many BIM programs, because they kind of use this word ambiguously. You know, is it tag? Is it label? Is it I don't know, a keynote or whatever? Tag has a very specific meaning in the IFC. The meaning is it is an ID of that element that is part of that identifies it in the original authoring application. So, for example, this IFC file came from Revit. So whenever I look at the tag field, I should find, in this case, the Revit element ID. And that's exactly what I do find in there. This looks like a Revit element ID in there. And if this came from ArchiCAD, I would expect to find an ArchiCAD element ID, I forget the term for it, but they're equivalent of element ID. So that's the rule. In general, as a user, you should not touch the tag field. That is generally there. 9 out of 10 times, don't touch it. The software will generate that for you, just like it generates the global ID attribute. Don't touch it, leave it alone. Technically, you can change, like nothing's stopping you from changing it, just that there is a very strong agreement written down to leave that for the software guys to write it down. And the second part of that question was, can you have multiple tags? The answer is no, you cannot. You're not allowed to have multiple attributes of any kind. So for example, if you click add attribute, it disappears from the dropdown. You cannot add it twice. If I delete, now I can add it again. You can only have attributes once. And that's the same with property sets. You can only have a property set once. You can only have a property once. You're not allowed to define it twice. And that is actually black and white. It's actually written in the specification, written in code, that you're not allowed to have two duplicate attributes or properties. There are certain attributes and properties which allow you to have a list of values. So in that case, obviously you can have multiple values, but not in this case. People are answering here. That's good. Can you run an algorithm to determine any dirty data that has been imported? This is a great question. And in fact, Petru and I should cover ways of automatically checking IFCs. So checking if you have dirty IFC classes, if you have dirty data. But we're running out of time today, so we won't check that today. Can the label in the pset be a hyperlink to? Yeah, can the label in the pset be a hyperlink to building smart definition within? I don't fully understand that question, but I do. It's been on my to-do list for a while. I do plan to actually have a little tooltips which describe how you're meant to fill these things out, which all come in different languages and all that. So I will add that in the future release if that's what you're talking about. If not, the best bet is to use that search engine over here, the Blender BIM search IFC class. Add a link to, I don't really know what that's talking about. In quantity takeoff, you want to add user-defined fields such as ERP fields or codes. Yes, that's right. By the way, I should mention here that quantity takeoff is a concept that is similar to property sets, but they are properties that are specific to quantity takeoff. So down here, quantity sets, get it? Property sets, quantity sets. In fact, in a future IFC version, these two concepts will likely be merged anyway. It's almost exactly the same as a property set, but there are a few little details which maybe we'll talk about in a future session, which we won't cover today. But in a lot of aspects, it's very similar in that it's grouped into sets. Each set has a name. The standard name is prefixed with QTO underscore, and you can see here what applies is a wall-based quantities, whereas this one, I get a slab-based quantities, for example. Where?
One last question, Dion.
Okay, one last question. In the Twitch.
No, don't you have anything else here in your chat?
In the chat, can certain attributes and properties be set to favorites, that they're surfaced, that fields? Sure, why not? We're building this application. Why not? Submit a request for a feature. We'll build it. It sounds like a good idea. Are templates like MVD? Sorry, that's one final question, Petru. Are templates like MVDs? No, they are not like MVDs. We'll go into detail on creating property set templates later on. And MVDs are more like the level of okay. We won't start down that rabbit hole. We'll do that at another time. Okay, I've run out of questions.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
We can wrap it up. We are 1 minute over the schedule time. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Dion, for being having so much energy to do this marathon at the end of your day. I really appreciate this.
No worries. You too, Petru.
We stay in touch, everybody. Have a nice one.
Okay. See you guys. See you around next week.